Hey, I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, and I am here with Dan Scarborough. Dan is our lead analyst in Europe and tracks the data center market meticulously over there. And so, Dan, thanks so much for being here. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, hi, David. Very pleased to be here and looking forward to catching up with you on what's been going on for the last quarter.
Whenever we get to the end of these time periods from a data center industry perspective, there's always trends and things that I know that you and I and others can take away, and really kind of understanding where the data center industry has been. And so if you're listening to this podcast with me and Dan, this is going to be a time period where we go through what has gone on in Europe. And Dan and his team are neck deep in data and information in the main and secondary European data center markets. So Dan, before we do that, actually just give an overview of like, where did 2020 end for the European data center markets, and what was kind of like the end of the year story, and then that'll kind of launch us into where we are today.
So I think quite a few people were keen to see the back of 2020. The last year was challenging to lots of industries, not least the data center industry, with dealing with additional capacity and operating under challenging environments. But definitely 2020 was one of the strongest, if not the strongest year that we've seen for absorption from a data center perspective across most of the markets in Europe.
I think that was I think your comment was good about just the market where it ended, and then also that the thought is that I think for Europe it feels like it could be as strong as 2020.
Yeah, I think it definitely feels like it could be as strong as 2020. I mean, some of the challenges that we saw when we were talking to the operators is, capacity that was expected to close and lease in 2020 didn't close and lease. That doesn't mean it's capacity that isn't happening. I just think part of the legal process of getting these deals done has been taking longer than anticipated. So despite those deals that weren't done in 2020, when you look at the deals that should have been done in 2020 and are going to be done in 2021, plus the deals that are going to be done in 2021 as well, 2021 is shaping up to be, potentially as good as 2020.
Yeah, one of the things that we've talked about has been around the challenges to deliver supply in, not just like the primary markets that we, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, London, Paris, Dublin, those, but also some of the secondary markets. Talk about just that supply constraint. Why is it that in some of these markets, it is really hard to deliver capacity, and what are the impacts of that? Like I think you mentioned on a call that we had that you've seen some demand actually go to other markets because there is a lack of supply. So just talk about that and the challenges that the lack of supply can create in some of these markets.
Yeah, so I think it's been, the number of leases before, spades have been put in the ground, and kind of, capacity that's gone in some of the top markets, especially Frankfurt, has been indicative of the desire to stay in these key markets and trying to, reserve capacity before it's yet been built. You've also seen kind of the development in tier 2 markets like Berlin and also Zurich that are, not only taking potential capacity away from Frankfurt, but are also considered to be add-ons to those two markets. The power availability in some of the top markets seems to be quite challenging, as does availability of appropriately priced land assets, should we say.
Yeah.
And that's definitely happening in London, in the Slough region, and also in Frankfurt. And, that's creating, new developments outside of those traditional development zones, both geographically in places like Berlin, and also further afield, so slightly further out than you would have conventionally seen capacity in places like Frankfurt. So that's some stuff that we've been seeing going on. There seems to be a lot of capacity under development across all of the European markets, and that under development in various stages of kind of having identified or having the land asset under control, all the way through to going through the planning process. The capacity that we're seeing under development is of a significant amount, which I think is partially indicative of what people believe that the requirements are going to be for capacity in these markets over the next few years. I suppose the question is whether the amount of developing capacity is going to be taken up by those key cloud operators that are dominating from a customer perspective over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and if I compare that to the U.S., like I think one of the key differences is in most markets, or at least in major markets in Europe, you mentioned you're seeing that under construction capacity really grow because of what's anticipated and the challenges with delivering supply. In the U.S., there's certain markets where that's happening, but not in all major U.S. markets. And so I think that's one of the interesting differences between like North America and what's happening in Europe. I mean, I think everybody probably listening to this knows that the hyperscale community is really the one that has changed the dynamics in the market, just because of the size of those projects, how big they are, how fast they need to be delivered to the market to meet timelines. But like one of the other things that we've seen in Europe is this dual strategy of these companies, not just to go and lease large amounts of capacity, but also to own it and build it themselves. What have you seen related to that, Dan, in Europe, and is that a trend that you think will continue to happen?
Yeah, so I suppose there are a couple of things. I think that there's definitely a anticipation and kind of crystal ball gazing in terms of where the next markets are going to be, and having an appropriate land asset that's gone at the right stage with the right planning and right power, ready for take up by the customers. So there seems to be a lot of speculatively looking for appropriate land assets in tier two markets. The competition for tier two markets also seems to be potentially less than it is in tier one markets. And the absorption rates compared to the total amount of capacity in a place like Madrid compared to London is again a slightly different dynamic. So if you take someone like the Madrid market that traditionally has, I don't know, had say circa 35 megawatts of capacity from a colo perspective, has got different dynamics to the more established flat markets, where the outsourcing to colo isn't as kind of great as it has been in other locations. You then get a hyperscale operator coming in with kind of 3 times 5 megawatts as their initial kind of capacity for their availability zones. You only need 2 of them to come into Madrid, and you've kind of doubled the amount of total amount of capacity in a market like Madrid. So the movement and the growth in these tier 2 locations, I think that growth is kind of anticipated. I think the other thing that we're also seeing is that the commitment, the immediate commitments are to deliver a smaller amount of, or to kind of lease a smaller amount of capacity off of a couple of different operators. So to go into a site that might well be, say, 30 megawatts, but sign up for the initial 5 and give enough expansion for future demand. So I think there's certainly I wouldn't call it hedging their bets, but there seems to be a placing of capacity with multiple operators in single locations. But these operators are building out enough capacity to meet their clients' demands and future demands. So, it'd be interesting to see what happens at the end of 2021, because from what I've heard and been hearing, the hyperscale cloud operators are, are procuring capacity for a, next couple of years. And it'd be interesting to see how the absorption rate in 20 and 21, what happens in 2022, and whether that demand continues or whether it levels off for a period of time.
Yeah, at some point when we look back at 2018 and 2019 in the U.S., it's really the first time we saw such a significant amount of growth, and then somewhat of, everyone over here has labeled it kind of like a digestion period where there's just time that it takes for some of these companies to really move into this capacity, and that becomes their focus for a period of time, and then it has ramped up again. And so I totally agree. I mean, I think 2022 will be very interesting to watch. Help us understand what the regulatory environments are like, in some of these different countries where we've seen some significant growth, and then at times we've seen, a slowdown because of some of the changes that have been made related to, it might be power, it might be data sovereignty, but what are some of and maybe what is the tone today, do you feel like, in Europe as it relates to the regulatory environments?
Yeah, so that's quite interesting. So there is a huge push from a European perspective to become kind of zero carbon. You've got the COP22 meeting in London later on this year, and so there's a big push for all industries to kind of be aware of their carbon emissions and their kind of climate change, the impact that they're having on climate change. The data center industry in Europe announced at the beginning of this year a climate neutral data center pact that had a number of the large operators and also the industry associations kind of signing up to, as you would, if you look behind the commitment, it's certainly a kind of a preemptive move to avoid legislation from a government perspective. So I think that as the overarching kind of dynamic has led to certainly a few interesting political stroke social impacts in locations like France and Amsterdam, or France and the Netherlands are two that spring to mind, where data centers in the Netherlands are being considered as potentially negative for the amount of water that they're consuming. Data centers in France, potentially having certain planning challenges at a regional level. I think overall, the last year has certainly increased the profile for the sector, and people have certainly been very grateful for digital infrastructure and its ability for society to continue somewhat unencumbered during the pandemic. But there's also a much better understanding of what they are, where they're being located, the associated planning issues, power that's being consumed, that type of stuff. So it is becoming a more challenging development environment than it has been historically. One of the things that I suppose also important to bear in mind is that especially for the larger operators, this is their business. So being prepared and making sure they've got enough land assets, they've got enough power provisioned, and they're able to deal with the capacity requirements moving forward is also something that they're doing very well. And there seems to be a lot of kind of positioning from a country region perspective for being a digital gateway and promoting this kind of digitization process and enabling new data center capacity to come into its countries. And we've seen that with France and kind of announcements that the French government have made, and other locations that are certainly trying to promote themselves as destinations for data centers. One of the positive things from a geographical perspective is if you look at Brexit, right, which happened at the end of last year, that doesn't seem to have had any impact on the data center capacity in the UK. And if anything, we've seen, a significant number of new developments in the UK and a very encouraging kind of absorption rate from a UK market perspective. So, no, it's a very exciting industry to be in at the minute, David.
Well, I totally agree, and I think the rest of the year will be really fun to watch, especially in Europe and the markets you're focused on. Dan, thank you. If you want to learn more about Data Center Hawk, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the U.S., and moving forward, what's happening in Asia, you can check out our site. It's datacenterhawk.com and find out all about it. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.